Did you know that the chocolate bar you eat might have cost a child their childhood? More than 1 million children work on cocoa farms, some as young as 9 years old, working long hours with no school and no rest. Major companies profit from their suffering, while we celebrate with chocolate on our holidays. Behind that sweet taste lies unspeakable bitterness and unseen tears and blood. Between the forests of Côte d'Ivoire and our store shelves, childhood is stolen and humanity forgotten. This is the story no one wants you to know, and you'll never look at chocolate the same way again. It begins in the lush green belt of West Africa, a land rich in soil, rain, and the fruit of the cocoa tree. Ivory Coast and Ghana, 2 countries that together produce more than 60% of the world's cocoa. The sweet foundation of chocolate, a global delicacy, begins in silence and shadows. But beneath the trees where cocoa pods grow, there is no sweetness. There is labor, harsh, unpaid, and often invisible labor. The legacy of cocoa in Africa is not merely agricultural. It is historical, political, and deeply painful. Cocoa was introduced to West Africa by European colonialists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Its cultivation grew rapidly, promising economic development. But it came with chains. European powers created a system that forced African laborers to work cocoa plantations under oppressive conditions. Though colonization ended on paper, the systems of exploitation remained intact. By the 1990s, the world's appetite for chocolate had grown into a $60 billion industry. But in the forests of Ivory Coast, children as young as 6 swung machetes longer than their arms. They hauled heavy sacks of cocoa pods, worked under the sun for up to 14 hours a day, and were routinely beaten if they slowed down. Many of them had never tasted chocolate. These children were not just poor, they were enslaved. Many had been trafficked from neighboring Mali, Burkina Faso, and Togo. Promised work or schooling, they were sold into bondage, disappearing into farms hidden from international eyes. A 2000 report by the U.S. State Department called it plainly. Thousands of children were working in the worst forms of child labor. In 2001, a BBC investigation exposed the use of trafficked children in cocoa farms. The world saw their faces for the first time, thin, bruised, tired. They were boys who had become tools. And yet, the chocolate flowed. Supermarket shelves in Europe, North America, and beyond overflowed with confections. Wrapped in gold foil and velvet branding, these products sold joy and nostalgia, while hiding trauma and abuse. As Carol Off writes in Bitter Chocolate, we eat the product of their lives. Their dreams, the disconnect between luxury and suffering was not accidental. It was designed. The world did not want to know, but the truth had been planted, like a seed, and its bitter fruit was beginning to show. In the heart of West Africa, beyond the reach of paved roads and tourist maps, lies the human cost of the world's chocolate addiction. In Ivory Coast and Ghana, cocoa is more than a crop. It is a lifeline, a curse, and a quiet war that consumes the futures of the poor. These nations produce the majority of the world's cocoa. For them, cocoa is currency. It is the cornerstone of national economies. But this wealth never reaches the hands that toil to create it. In rural villages across Ivory Coast, young boys vanish. They leave home after being told they'll find paid work, perhaps schooling, maybe a future. What they find instead is servitude. They are taken across borders in the backs of trucks, sold in markets like livestock, and delivered to cocoa farms buried deep in the forest. There, the promises end. These children are not paid. They are not educated. They do not go home. They carry sacks heavier than their bodies. They use machetes without protection to hack down cocoa pods from trees. Many are scarred for life, physically and mentally. The International Labor Organization defines this as one of the worst forms of child labor, and it is common. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that more than 200,000 children were working on cocoa farms in Ivory Coast alone. Tens of thousands were believed to be trafficked. Some were as young as 6 years old. The conditions are brutal. Food is scarce. Water is unclean. Rest is not guaranteed. Children are often punished for working too slowly. Some are whipped. Some run away and are caught. Others disappear completely. And yet, the outside world kept eating. Cocoa buyers, the first link in the chain between the farm and the global market, turned a blind eye. Middlemen bought beans with no questions asked. They moved cocoa through warehouses and shipping ports, where the identities of its origins blurred and disappeared. Ghana, often praised for its relative stability and official stance against child labor, was no exception. There, too, children were used to keep the cost of cocoa low and the profits of exporters high. In both countries, governments lacked the resources or the will to fully stop it. Families, trapped in poverty, had little choice. In many villages, selling a child into labor was seen as a necessity. There were no schools, no clinics, no real alternatives. One less mouth to feed, one more coin on the table. But the suffering was not invisible. Reporters, aid workers, and whistleblowers tried to speak out. Some were silenced, others ignored. In Bitter Chocolate, Karoloff recounts her own journey into this hidden world, where silence is enforced and pain is normalized. She interviewed children who had escaped, survivors who had no words for what they had endured. Many never knew who had bought the chocolate they helped produce. Many didn't even know what chocolate was. Meanwhile, European and North American chocolate companies published glossy reports showcasing corporate responsibility and ethical sourcing. But behind these words were loopholes and lies. The bitter truth is this: the chocolate we eat comes at a price. And for decades, that price has been paid by the smallest, poorest, and most forgotten hands. The harvest continues, and so does the silence. Behind every chocolate bar lies a vast, complex system. It stretches across continents, from remote farms in West Africa to factories in Europe and North America, to the shelves of supermarkets around the world. This system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. And its design is built on inequality. The machinery of exploitation begins at the farm. Here, cocoa is harvested by the poorest people in the supply chain, often by children, many unpaid. A single cocoa farmer in Ivory Coast or Ghana might earn less than $1 per day, a wage that cannot sustain a family, let alone provide education, healthcare, or a path forward. These farmers do not sell directly to chocolate companies. They sell to local buyers, middlemen known as pisteurs, who travel by truck to collect sacks of cocoa beans. These middlemen are the first layer in a long supply chain. They pay low prices, often using rigged scales or debts as leverage, and transport the cocoa to larger cooperatives or traders, who then sell it to exporters. From there, it enters the international market. At each step, profit is added, but not for the farmer. Cocoa is shipped in massive quantities, thousands of tons at a time, to factories in Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Canada, and the United States. It is processed, blended, and transformed. It is marketed with smiling children, golden wrappers, and phrases like ethically sourced or fair trade. But these labels often mask the same reality, that the core ingredients were purchased from a system that depends on the exploitation of children and the poverty of farmers. The world's largest chocolate companies, Nestlé, Mars, Hershey, Mondelez, and Ferrero, dominate the market. Together, they control more than half of the global chocolate industry. And while they do not own the farms, they own the narrative. After media investigations and human rights reports began exposing child labor in cocoa fields in the early 2000s, the industry responded. But not with reform, with damage control. The result was a series of voluntary pledges and self-regulated codes of conduct. The most notable of these was the Harkin-Engel Protocol, signed in 2001. It was a non-binding agreement between U.S. lawmakers and chocolate companies, promising to eliminate the worst forms of child labor in cocoa production by 2005. The deadline passed. So did the next one, and the next. By 2025, nearly 2 decades after the original promise, child labor in cocoa farming has not been eliminated. In fact, it persists at alarmingly high levels, especially in Ivory Coast and Ghana. Reports estimate that over 1.5 million children still work in hazardous conditions across West Africa's cocoa industry. Some wield machetes. Others carry heavy loads or apply toxic pesticides. Many work without pay. Chocolate companies continue to rely on third-party suppliers, allowing them to distance themselves from the abuses at the source. They claim to support sustainable farming, yet less than 6% of the final retail price of a chocolate bar ever reaches the farmer. The rest is swallowed by processors, distributors, and branding. Carol Off, in Bitter Chocolate, writes that these companies have mastered the art of selective ignorance. Their executives visit sanitized farms, attend staged ceremonies, and publish reports filled with carefully chosen statistics. They rarely, if ever, set foot in the farms hidden deep in the forest, where trafficked children sleep on wooden planks and work under threat. This is not a failure of oversight. It is the result of a system that was built to extract value from poverty and insulate those in power from its consequences. The machinery turns. Cocoa is harvested, bought, sold, blended, packaged. Chocolate is eaten. Smiles are sold. Profits are recorded. Meanwhile, the farmer remains poor. The child remains enslaved. And the lie continues. This is the true engine of the chocolate industry, a machine that feeds on silence. In the margins of every major industry lies a shadow economy. Cocoa is no different. The chocolate trade, though wrapped in sweetness, has long been entangled with the dark networks of organized crime. Where there is profit and weak regulation, corruption thrives. And where corruption thrives, criminal enterprise follows. In West Africa, the cocoa trade has become fertile ground for trafficking, not only of cocoa, but of people. Children are smuggled across borders, sold to cocoa farms, and never seen again. The traffickers are not lone predators. They are part of structured networks, organized, financed, and protected. Carol Off, in Bitter Chocolate, documents how child trafficking operations from Mali into Ivory Coast are often overseen by groups that operate with impunity. They work hand in hand with transporters, corrupt border guards, and complicit local authorities. The trade is simple and lucrative. A child costs far less than a machine, works longer hours, and asks no questions. But the crime doesn't end at the farm. Once cocoa is harvested, the product itself enters a supply chain vulnerable to smuggling, fraud, and money laundering. During the Ivorian civil conflict in the early 2000s, vast quantities of cocoa were illegally diverted from government-controlled ports to be sold through rebel-controlled routes. Cocoa became a tool for financing warlords and militias. Some of these operations were protected by high-level officials. Others were run directly by criminal syndicates with ties to political elites. Cocoa smuggling routes stretched across borders, from the Ivory Coast to Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Liberia, funneling untaxed, unregulated beans into global markets. Export certificates were forged, origins were faked, containers were misdeclared. These acts allowed dirty cocoa, tainted by slavery, theft, or war, to be laundered into clean exports bound for Europe. Meanwhile, cartels and criminal groups in other parts of the world took note. In Latin America, especially in regions of Colombia and Brazil, cocoa farming has been infiltrated by drug cartels, who use cocoa as a front for laundering cocaine profits and establishing control over rural territories. Though not as dominant as in West Africa, these cases highlight the global vulnerability of the cocoa sector to criminal enterprise. Even further up the supply chain, in countries like Switzerland, Belgium, and Canada, the money trail becomes almost untraceable. Billions of dollars move through banks and trade offices each year, much of it based on contracts signed in anonymity. Shell companies and offshore accounts mask ownership. Profits earned through exploitation are protected by legal walls. Chocolate corporations, many of which have their headquarters in tax-friendly nations, benefit from these systems, sometimes knowingly, sometimes by design. When journalists ask about sourcing, the answers are often the same. We do not control the farms. Or, we source from intermediaries. These responses are true, but they are not innocent. The truth is that organized crime finds its strength in opacity, and the chocolate industry, with its long, murky supply chains and willful ignorance, provides the perfect cover. Efforts have been made to fight back. International agencies have attempted to track illegal cocoa movements. Investigative journalists have risked their safety to expose the networks. Occasionally, arrests are made, but the system rarely changes. The profits are too high, the oversight is too weak, and the political will is too compromised. To the consumer, the crime remains invisible. A bar of chocolate carries no fingerprints, but behind it may lie a network of smuggling, child slavery, forged papers, and bribes. And at every level, someone profits. In the end, this is not just a story of stolen childhoods. It is a story of organized greed, of how sweetness is manufactured from suffering, hidden behind wrappers, and sold as innocence. And still, the world keeps eating. The story of chocolate is not just about candy. It is a story about power, how it is used, who it serves, and who pays the price. From the cocoa fields of West Africa to the factories of Europe and the shelves of North American supermarkets, the journey of a chocolate bar is paved with silence. It is the silence of children working in slavery, the silence of farmers trapped in poverty, the silence of corporations that know and do not act, and the silence of consumers who do not ask. Carol Off's bitter chocolate did not simply expose an industry. It held up a mirror to a global system built on exploitation, one where luxury is funded by suffering, where truth is buried under marketing, and where change is promised but never delivered. The chocolate industry is not broken. It is working exactly as intended. It extracts the most from those who have the least, and it does so behind a curtain of sweetness. But that curtain can be pulled back. It begins with awareness, with asking questions, with refusing to accept the lie that a label or a promise makes a product just. Real justice requires more. It requires systemic change, laws with teeth, prices that reflect dignity, and accountability that cannot be bought. Until then, every bite of chocolate contains a question. Who suffered for this? And the industry hopes you never ask. This was a glimpse into the dark side of cocoa production, a story rarely told. But the suffering did not end there. In the next video, we explore one of the darkest chapters of colonial history, the Congo Free State under King Leopold II, where human lives were turned into profit and their cries were met with silence. Click here to watch and let history continue its story.